Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Thomas. Before my talk, I would like to thank TEDxSCIE. I would like to thank Daniel for the friendly invitation. I would also like to thank the philosophy department of the University of Wisconsin for the awesome philosophy education. I would also like to thank my mentor and my professor, Elliott, for his brilliant ideas, guidance, and help. Okay. So today I'm going to start by introducing a famous person. His name is Rene Descartes. Descartes is a famous philosopher, mathematician, and scientist. Just in case you have never heard of him, he is the famous philosopher who said, "I think, therefore I am," to prove his own existence. He is the famous mathematician who invented the Cartesian coordinate system. So if you have any trouble with math, especially coordinate geometry, you should go talk to him. Alright, so one day he got nothing to do, as a philosopher. He had to do some philosophy, right? Yeah, so he starts by thinking about what he believes and whether his beliefs are subject to any doubt. So consider the two following everyday examples. When we put a chopstick into a glass of water, we see that the chopstick it's bent. At least it appears that it's bent in the water, but in reality, is it bent? No, it's perfectly straight. Well, science has told us that, it's due to refraction. Consider another example, the rainbow. When we see a rainbow in the sky with different colors, it seems to us that the rainbow is there. However, in reality, it is not located at a specific distance from the observer. And the scientific explanation is that it's due to optical illusion caused by the water droplets. Well, what have we learned from these two examples? Number one, our eyes have deceived us, and they're not perfectly reliable. Number two, it seems that ordinarily we acquire knowledge from making observations. We see things. And if our eyes are not perfectly reliable, it might be the case that all our knowledge from sensory experiences are subject to doubt, and our beliefs are therefore shaky and unjustified. Well, we can pause and think about it for a sec and consider this claim. Well, there are a bunch of people sitting in the auditorium listening to Thomas talking about philosophy. Well, questions are, number one, do you believe that the statement is true? And number two, are you entitled to be certain about your belief? Well, personally, of course, I think that the statement is true, but I don't think I am entitled to be certain about this belief. Why? Well, because according to Descartes' idea, I could be having a vivid dream while I'm asleep in my bedroom, like this. Okay, then I think you guys have the experience of having a dream that's so real that you can hardly tell the difference between dream and reality, or you can't even tell whether it's a dream or not. And the same thing goes to the movie characters in the movie Inception. Well, when they are working on a mission, is it really the case that they are in fact working on a real mission, or is it the case that they are dreaming? Well, consider other two skeptical hypotheses. Well, think about Neo in the movie Matrix. Well, when he thinks that he is talking to someone, is it really the case that he is talking to a real person, having a real conversation? Or is it the case that what seems to be a person, what seems to be a real person, only a computer simulation? Well, think about Agents of S.C.I.E.L.D. When they think they are living in a happy world, hanging out with their friends, are they living in a real world, or are they manipulated by some mad scientist or an AI who try to trick them into believing that they live in the real world? I mean, most of us, if not all, think that we live in a real, material, objective, mind-independent world. But then, can we conclusively rule out the possibility that we are having a vivid dream? Can we conclusively rule out the possibility that we are living in a computer simulation? Can we conclusively rule out the possibility that there are some mad scientists out there manipulating our mind, tricking us into believing that we are living in the real world? Well, I don't think so. then what justified reasons do we have for believing that we are living in the real world? And why think the real world hypothesis is true, but the skeptical hypotheses are false? And more importantly, if we aren't even justified in believing that we are in the real world, how can we possibly have any knowledge of anything? And these are the important questions that Cartesian skepticism throws at us. And how do we answer these questions? Well, in order to attack skepticism, some people would use everyday evidence and other people would use scientific evidence. For example, one might say, yo, bro, just look around. I mean, I see people, I eat food, I drink water, I sit on chairs, I see tables. What else do you want? This is as real as it can be. How can it possibly be all fake? Good try, but that's the response from the skeptics. They're going to say, in any skeptical scenario, you will have exactly the same internal subjective experience as you do in the real world. Therefore, the evidence you have can neither rule out those skeptical hypotheses, nor act as good reasons to believe that you are, in fact, living in the real world. So it fails. The evidence does not favor the real world hypothesis over any of the skeptical hypotheses. What about scientific evidence? Well, some scientists think that science can solve skepticism. For example, a person used a recent scientific research done by Oxford theoretical physicist, and he tries to use the argument to attack the computer simulation hypothesis. His argument or reasoning roughly works as follows. Premise 1, if our world is simulated by a quantum computer, the computer requires 10 to the power of whatever atoms. Premise 2, there aren't even that many atoms in the entire universe. Well, the conclusion should be quite obvious. Our world is not simulated by a quantum computer. Well, at first glance, it seems that this is a pretty good argument against the computer simulation hypothesis. But here's a response from the skeptics. The scientific experimentation is itself under the cloud of Cartesian doubt. Well, in other words, in order to show that the scientific experimentation and its result is valid, the scientists have to presuppose that we live in a world made up of atoms. And the things that they see and use are not simulated by a computer. Well, then the argument based on science fails because the argument presupposes that the real world hypothesis is true. So we can see that in order to show that the simulation hypothesis is false, the argument presupposes that the simulation hypothesis is false. It's circular reasoning. That's that argument. Right, then, in general, we need to see that no matter what empirical evidence we give, the evidence cannot favor the real world hypothesis over any of the skeptical hypotheses. The reason is that, again, as I said before, we will have exactly the same internal subjective experience in the real world and in the fake world. So as a consequence, science cannot help us solve skepticism. And can science solve other philosophical problems? Well, some of them, yes. Well, some philosophical problems require empirical input, and science can provide us answers. And other philosophical problems gradually evolved to become scientific problems. For example, some philosophical problems in the philosophy of mind, such as the philosophy of consciousness or the mind-body problem, definitely requires help from science, such as biology, physics, neurobiology, neuroscience, and so on, and even psychology. And other problems are about the beginning of the stuff, or the beginning of the universe, the beginning of human beings, and that definitely require help from physics and biology. But I want to point out that some other philosophical problems cannot be ultimately answered by science. And here are two broad categories. Number one, conceptual problems. In philosophy, we usually deal with conceptual analyses. For example, in metaphysics and philosophy of science, we ask questions like, what is causation? What's the causal relationship between A and B? For example, when I say, the fact that I opened my hand caused the microphone to drop on the floor, what do I mean? In epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, we ask questions like, what is knowledge? What is a justified belief? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for one to know that a given statement is true? Well, it seems quite clear that conceptual analysis, conceptual problems like these, cannot be solved by science. Here's category 2, fundamental ethical problems. In ethics and moral philosophy, we ask questions like, what's right and wrong? What's justice and equality? How to be a good person? How to live a good life? Then how can science deal with questions like these? Well, to begin with, we need to see that descriptive claims are separate from normative claims. Descriptive claims are about what is the case, and normative claims are about what should be the case, or what ought to be the case. In economics, we call it positive claims and normative claims. So it is studied outside abortion is legally acceptable in many countries, are considered as descriptive claims. And we should study hard. You should not torture other people for fun, are normative claims. Also considered a traditional trolley car problem. I think this is a very famous thought experiment proposed by moral philosophers, and I think everyone should be pretty familiar with this, so I'll briefly talk about this. Suppose that you're a train driver driving a train. So right now you're driving the train, and unfortunately, as usual, unfortunately, you see that you can't stop the train. And at the end of the road, there are 5 people working there. And, well, if you don't do anything, you will crash into those 5 people and they will die. And at the same time, you see that there's a sidetrack. Well, you can turn the wheel to the sidetrack and kill that one person. And consequently, you can avoid killing those 5 people, but instead you will kill the one person. The question is, what should you do? Well, philosophers have proposed different answers and different theories to answer the moral dilemma. But anyway, philosophers are not interested in the descriptive question, because the descriptive question is a sociological question. What do people do? What would people do in that circumstance? That's I would say, uninteresting, the philosophers would say, uninteresting question, because you can simply do a survey. You can just ask people, hey, dude, what would you do, right? But they are interested in the normative question, the real philosophical question, the ethical question. What should people do in that circumstance, right? It's a normative question. Well, here's the proposal. Well, philosophical theory and ethical theory called utilitarianism tells us that the morally good action is the one that maximizes overall total happiness. So a utilitarian would say killing 5 people involves more unhappiness than killing one person. So in this case, we should turn to the sidetrack and kill that one person. And a utilitarian would say that's the moral thing to do, that's the good thing to do. But notice here, I'm not here arguing that utilitarianism is the correct moral theory, although it fits our intuition pretty well. I'm saying that, well, science by itself might explain why we behave in such and such way, but it doesn't tell us why we should behave in such and such way. So science can answer the descriptive questions, like what would we do? Why do we react that way? But science cannot answer the real ethical question. What should we do? Similarly, science cannot answer other normative ethical questions either. Consider the question, how to live a good life. I think it's a very, very important question that everyone needs to ponder about. So here's a proposal. Ethical hedonists are making a normative claim that maximizing your pleasure and minimizing your goal should be the only ultimate goal that you care about. And this should be separated from psychological hedonism. Psychological hedonism is making a descriptive claim, which says that maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain is in fact the only ultimate goal that everyone, in fact, cares about? Well, I think science does have a say and can help us determine whether psychological hedonism is plausible or not. But how can science confirm or falsify the normative claim that we ought to, that we should live our life in such and such way? Well, now I have shown that science has its own limits. Science cannot answer all questions, no matter how advanced it becomes in the future. Well, don't get me wrong, I mean, science is very, very important, and it is considered to be an objective, rational inquiry, but we need not and cannot rely only on science. And we still need something else to help us answer deep philosophical questions. And if you guys have heard of the term scientism, then you know that's the position that I'm arguing against. Scientism is an ideology that promotes science as the only objective means by which society should determine descriptive and normative values. I'm arguing that science cannot answer real philosophical questions like the conceptual problems that I've mentioned above, like the analysis of knowledge, the analysis of causation, and the fundamental ethical problems like the ones that I have mentioned above. And I want to say it's not true that all knowledge can be reduced ultimately to scientific knowledge. And here's a remaining important question. Well then, since science is not all-powerful, then where should we get help from? Take a wild guess. Well, not surprisingly, philosophy. Right? I mean, we should use philosophy to come up with sound arguments. Sound arguments are good arguments. Good arguments are those arguments that are valid, and at the same time, all the premises have to be true. And with good arguments, we get true conclusions, and that's what we want. So to end my talk, I want to emphasize the importance of philosophy. Philosophy is as important as science. And if we read more about the history of philosophy and the history of science, we will learn that science actually comes from philosophical inquiry. So we can't even do good science without doing philosophy. Feel free to read more about the Greek philosophers like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. Feel free to read more about René Descartes, Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, and you'll learn that. And lastly, I want to say that rationality and the inquiry of knowledge requires both good science and good philosophy, and we cannot eliminate either of them. Thank you.